Next up, we have Nathan doing a talk on our own data and what exactly we can do with it.
Okay. Thanks. I'm glad to be here for a lot of reasons. If you don't know me, my name is Nathan Willis, as my accent reveals. I'm from south of London. But I've been here for about 5 years working on a PhD, which is a very wise and practical thing to start after 40, but which I'm happy to say was conferred this past summer, so it's done. Yes, thank you. So now I have to look for gainful employment, so let me know if I can help you. Mostly what I spend my time on is font and text wrangling stuff, but I have other interests, including this, which is sort of a weird esoteric topic. I had originally meant to present this in Busan, but I wasn't able to travel. So the second chance is great, and I got to sort of revisit what I was going to say. Along those lines, I also gave sort of a companion to this talk at GWADEC, which is focused solely on GNOME stuff, so desktop applications. And I talked about how desktop apps in GNOME could or couldn't work with data exports. But that's clearly not just a desktop app problem. So there's a lot of things in the online service world that really need a server component to them. So I will recap that GNOME stuff briefly, but I will not be saying the same things, at least I hope. So yeah, it sounds vague if the title isn't clear. We in the free software community, we talk a lot about this ability to own your data and how that's important. It's not just nice to have. It's, possibly even vital. The discourse online about that can be pretty impassioned, and it usually says you should leave the services that you don't control and come over to free software. At times, it can even get vitriolic, which is clearly not helpful. If you don't believe me, just go to Mastodon and search for the word complicit. And someone thinks that you're responsible for a lot of ills if you don't have the same priorities in this regard as they do. I think it's better to just stay down to earth and focus on stuff that actually empowers people. But I'm curious, these data export things are very common. You raise your hand if you actually done a data export, an account export, ever. How about just in the last 12 months? Anybody done one pretty recently? Okay, just like shout out what sort of data did you export? Anyway. Email. Was it? Twitter. Okay. Sorry? Discord. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's a topic that has interested me for a really long time. Do you remember Google Reader? It was a news reader aggregator. They took it out and buried it in the woods. But very quickly after that happened, there were these third-party export utilities and use your export utilities. And the reason was that you could export the subscription list as OPML, but you could not export other stuff like which articles you hadn't read. And what you had starred or favorited. And I used Reader for work to research things, so that subscription list alone wasn't enough. And those tools worked. I actually wrote about Reader is Dead for LWN back at the time. That's the one that sort of gave you a local view on what it had scraped from your account. But it's not a feed reader. This export tool is sort of frozen. It's a block of ice. So I had to move something else. I moved to Feedly just because it was available. Eventually I had to leave Feedly because I started locking down features too. And again, the export was a problem. So eventually I did get to where I was running my own TTRSS server, which I own and control in that sense. And then a couple years ago, this whole stop using web services mantra started gaining a lot of traction. And I got curious during the pandemic. I spent a lot of my spare time just sort of looking at the services I was using and what I felt like was or wasn't worth self-hosting. A lot of the guides I saw were not really helpful on that. People would describe their own experience, but it was usually focused on like avoiding ads or blocking people, blocking communities. But they also typically lumped everything together like it's only one problem, and it's clearly not. Different data types need different treatment. I found it more useful to assess the services based on this public-private boundary and what crosses it. So, you send a message to someone that's private to public. The feed reader is pulling public into your private. You could have a discussion entirely in the public, and then there's things that you don't really ever send to someone. So I prioritized those, the stuff that stays private all the time, like my calendar. And my TTRSS server is running on Debian Freedom Box, and so I added the Radicale server to that and brought in my contacts the same way. Then for no particular reason this year, I just started downloading and requesting all the downloads I could find as kind of a procrastination, I guess. And I got really interested in looking at them together. This is a rough list of the stuff I requested. I'm sure there's some things missing that I tried. There are others. I don't actually have Apple accounts or Microsoft accounts, so don't think about this as being the exhaustive list of things that you could export data from. But it's at least a sampling of it. And the practical question that I wanted to poke at in the talk context is whether the take your data and leave thing is going to work for people, or is it going to leave them stuck? Like you tell people you need to stop using these services and come join us in free software, then they show up and say, okay, what next? If we don't really have a compelling answer, that's kind of a problem. I think we have a responsibility to at least see if it's worth using these exported account data sets. And that means looking at the data set itself and also at what software is available to work with it. I mean, if you just download it and it sits in your hard drive as a multi-gigabyte file, is that good enough? Might be for some cases, but hopefully there's more possible than just that. And also, I really wanted to focus on the user experience for like a real person, rather than just like enumerating things. So the outline for today, I briefly talk about what's in these sorts of online service exports and the utilities. And that portion of the topic could sort of become a mile wide and an inch deep if I'm not careful. So after like an overview of that, I want to get into a deep dive just for one specific use case for Twitter, which I think is fairly representative. There's some tangents involved in that. But then also want to end with the so what now question, because it's a fairly abstract topic. Does this inform decisions that we make? Is there something that people who care about free software can do collectively that makes a difference? So briefly, what can you get? The interesting thing to me is that almost always you get usable files. The best stuff format-wise tends to be for older established transports like calendaring and contacts and email and stuff like that. Most other stuff is JSON, which is annoying. I mean, it could be XML, but what's interesting is that I didn't encounter anyone who provided a download that was not usable by a third-party tool. But beyond that, the big service providers are in the habit of bundling up like a browsing interface that you can open locally and look at your data set. This is the Twitter one. Sorry, this is the Google one from Google Takeout. In my Takeout, I got 57 different categories of things. There's categories I didn't know existed, like arts and culture. But that's the local HTML browser interface you get. Those are live links to the other parts of the giant archive, and it has explanations for things. When the output is HTML, it links to it directly, and then when it doesn't, it tends to do a pretty good job of documenting what's included. So this is your Google Tasks, and it's got the schema for the JSON there. I thought it was odd it wasn't in iCalendar to-do format, but at least it's documented. I am leaving out some potentially important ones. I realize, like I don't use Google's health and fitness data, never have, so I don't know what they provide there. It's possible that some data sets are not as good as far as the openness of the format that you get. And it's not all rosy. Office documents you get from Google are either Microsoft Office format or rendered to PDF. So that's clearly not ideal. Twitter, very similarly, you get this local HTML page. Well, I say HTML, it's actually condensed JSON with all internal IDs for things like messages and user IDs and things like that. And then there is JavaScript in this page that sort of live simulates what it looks like. And that's what it is. It's this one page, and you can sort of infinitely scroll through it, but if you have several years worth of stuff, that's not really what you would want to do. You can search it though. So let's say I needed to find my, what did I search for there? Actually, that might not have been the search one. Well, it is searchable. The downside is that, as you'll notice, my avatar image is everywhere there, and that's because you only get your tweets. I mean, that sounds obvious, but if you have a conversation thread with someone, you get your half of it only. You don't even get the statement that your thread, your messages are applied to, which is a pretty severe limitation, I think. I was reminded immediately of the notion that half a conversation is not really anything. Better Off Ted, it's a documentary about research and development. If you haven't seen it, the metaphor stuck with me. They're forced to split up. Lem notes that when they work together, they're like a swan, beautiful. And Phil replies that as half a swan himself, all he does is make a big mess and die. After I made this slide, I remembered that there's also this cut a pile of sand in half. It's still 2 piles of sand. Each one is a pile of sand. Cut a table in half, and it's not. But I prefer Lem and Phil. And I'm highlighting this half a conversation thing because it will come back later. Some other big services I want to highlight before just sort of moving on to the deep dive stuff. GitHub gives you virtually everything, entire repos, which you could clone those yourself anyway. But also like all of the attachments that people put into issues and threads and things, like the original version with the original file names and things. On the other hand, LinkedIn, it's a bunch of CSV files. Amazon, it's massive, but they include documentation as separate files in each little folder, which is interesting. Some of that's usable, like if you had your purchase history, you could like look up everything that you purchased and, you know, reuse that information yourself. Your Prime Video history, you can record what stuff you watched. That's potentially useful in another context, even if it's just sort of raw data. But there are also some lowlights to lowlight, I guess. GitLab, nothing. There's no account export feature in GitLab. There's an issue open about it. If you're interested to read that, they're not persuaded. Firefox accounts, so like Firefox Sync, again, nothing. This troubles me more than almost anything else. I mean, if you thought we were just going to be complaining about proprietary services, like buckle up. Online service means anything. Like, just because the source code is open doesn't mean they have a different right to have your data and not give it to you, in my opinion. Wikipedia, I don't know what I was expecting scenario-wise, but surprised. There's no export there either. Identica, if you remember that from pre-Mastodon days, again, no export functionality at all. Interestingly enough, there is a third-party tool for this, which just sort of scrapes API calls page by page, and it is based on what Paul Wise used to do to archive the Debian publicity team's Identica account. Mastodon, it's newer. You would expect it to have something, and it does have something, but what it gives you is raw ActivityPub objects, and then there's some random stuff that's distinct from that. That's opaque stuff. I'm not even sure if I can show it without revealing secrets, but it isn't usable as is, and it's not anything that you can navigate. you don't have the original file names for things, so you have no choice but to figure out a way to use this in a Mastodon context, as far as I can tell. And then apart from that download, which is just, that's the export option if you go to the export settings page. There's other things you have to get separately, like, you muted people or muted a domain or who you're following. Those are separate CSV downloads, and for whatever reason, you can't download a list of your followers. Best I can tell, this is just one of those weird things that project leadership dislikes for undiscussed reasons. I'm glad that Mastodon exists, that there's a lot of pitfalls to the project, things that the project doesn't want to fix. Remember quote tweets, for instance. The developers were just sure, without having researched, that quote tweets were always bad. And it took years of people showing research papers to persuade them that there might be another viewpoint on those. Search is not great. It's just, it is what it is. This course, I think this is the last one I'm going to highlight from the free things. Raw CSV, here again, you're going to face that same problem with half conversation. But, it's, in theory, something you can download and save for yourself. The takeaways that I want to highlight from just comparing apples to oranges is I think it's not okay for Mastodon or the other free services to give a bad export experience. The big commercial vendors are doing a lot better in that regard. So you shouldn't get a free pass. Mastodon servers can and do shut down, or they get unstable, or they get taken offline through cyber attack or change policies. Things happen, and it's just in the nature of services that you will want to export your stuff from them, even if it's free software. So that's the data, at least the smattering of it. There's more extensive coverage in the aquatic version of the talk if you want to look that up. I think the video isn't online yet. But if we're being practical, the other question is what the value is after you've got it. I kind of broke it down into 4 categories. I'm sure there's other ways to do that. Maybe you just want to have it to read it, like your old messages. You might need to look up something from those. That's fine. Maybe it's usable on its own, like the Office doc case or the contacts. You're not going to use a contacts vCard file in any way other than importing it into a contact manager, right? Maybe you want to copy it into an equivalent service somewhere else, so Twitter to Mastodon or so on. Or maybe you want to do something transformative and repurpose it in a new way on your own terms. Just looking at that usefulness, I'm going to summarize the sorts of issues that I ran into with the GNOME apps and discussed at Guadec. The main thing is that importing an outside data set is usually not well supported in free software apps. For instance, GNOME Maps. You get a ton of location and map data from your Google takeout. I believe that is actually good GeoJSON. There's a lot of different kinds of it in your download. Places you've been, places you've flagged, restaurants you've reviewed. And GNOME Maps can't import any of that because it doesn't import anything. But again, the point I want to make is that's not a failure of the application. It's just an unaddressed use case. So I think it's a small project. When they get around to it, that'll be useful for people, but don't expect to be able to use that directly. And in other cases, when you can import it, it's pretty rough. GNOME Calendar, you can pull in an iCalendar ICS file. Not a great user experience. Partly it's because iCalendar is old. But in reality, would you want to do this? Probably not. You probably want a CalDAV server, because it's not just one device you want to access your calendar on. There's other approaches, I know, but primarily you want a server that you connect to rather than something that lives only in this local app. Again, they will post the video sometime, but I just want to move on. and look at a case study. Working with a social network export, I've chosen Twitter as the ideal example for a couple of reasons. I mean, it has all the major problems that are prompting people these days to say you should stop using it. Sleaziness of the owner, negativity of interactions, all that stuff. And it's public, at least by default. For example, Facebook, when I've used that, that's not stuff that I would publish publicly. It's a little more private, so not as interesting as a case study. If it's private, it should stay private. If you live your life in the open on Twitter, then you maybe have more things you can do once you've downloaded that data. It's not the only archive that I've worked with extensively, but some of the others are pretty trivial, like email archives. If you remember the Google Takeout, it gives you inbox files. I actually set that up with not much. It's just too easy. There's not a lot to say there. It works too well. And then some of those reuse cases are really personalized, like what do you do with your photo collection? People want to separate that out and publish it or share it in a bunch of different ways. But this is our case study. Before we do that, I need to say that I am staunchly against the deleting your account thing for a particular reason, which I'll tell you about. And then too often, I think that this don't use the service you don't control thing blends into, let's deny the bad people at the bad companies our input. And I get why, I get the feeling of wanting to do something and strike back, so to speak, but I will tell you, and I will tell anyone that it doesn't really accomplish what you want it to. It's tempting. It's tempting to imagine Elon Musk seething in anger, tearfully pacing back and forth in his office when he hears that you've deleted your account. And probably an assistant comes in and he throws a weird angular-looking phone at them. Fun to think about. That doesn't happen. What happens is this. This is the reason. Link rot. That's from 2 days ago when I was wanting to add something to the slide deck. Many, many, many times in my PhD research, I ran headfirst into link rot like that, or stuff that's been taken down. And all this does is make the internet worse for real people. So the account deletion thing, you do not harm the company. You do harm other people. That's where I stand on that. And I think there are better options too. If you feel the need to take some action, that's a positive thing. Positive actions are generally preferable. It sounds a little philosophical, but practically speaking, it's better use of your time to help someone install an ad blocker than to give them a speech about how bad ads are, right? And I think that applies here as well. That being said, there are a lot of reasons why you still do want to do the export. I mentioned some of those with the Mastodon case. Things go out, policies change, or I think Twitter sometime this past year made it so that you have to be logged in to see most tweets. So yeah, absolutely make the archive and download it. So let's look at what the export includes. Remember, our 4 broad categories of what we do with them are use it as a library, import it directly, migrate it to a new service, or repurpose it in some transformation. I would say the 4 big categories, at least I know Twitter has other functions like live things, never use those. You have the tweets, you have direct messages, you have those lists of people, the accounts, and I guess there are lists of accounts you can do too. And then you have all of the things that you have bookmarked or liked. And 4 distinct categories of data, I think. This is that Twitter local index page I mentioned. Oh yeah, this is the search one. I should have swapped those 2 around. As I mentioned, the search is built in locally here, but it's also actually faking all of the tweets. You couldn't just put this up on a web server. It would be your entire multi-decade Twitter in that JSON file, and there's no navigating to a specific tweet in that method. On the other hand, if you just want to have it to search, it's probably fine as is. You don't necessarily need to do any more work on that. although you still only have half of your conversations. And the other downside to that is that you would have to do this for every service individually, so you have to get the Facebook one and search that separately. If you knew you had a conversation about a particular topic with one of your friends, you would have to search each of these little isolated downloads separately. On the other hand, there are a ton of tools out there designed just to make those Twitter exports more useful. This is not a complete list. This is just to the end of the slide. The first one is worth highlighting, I think, Dogsheep. This is a sort of meta project by Simon Willison, no relation. It is designed for his data exploring tool, data set. And it's a little bit focused on analytics and things. A lot of the others are designed to transform into something in particular or analyze for some particular reason. The one that I found most interesting is this one, Twitter Archive Parser. It actually takes that JSON file and transforms it into flat HTML. Importantly, the URLs in the original JSON are all, the identifiers in Twitter speak. It turns everything into actual links and cross-links things. It fetches the original media, the follower and follows lists. It does the API request to return from the ID the actual account name of the person and the real name if that's included. And it's non-destructive, which is excellent because you can toy around with it. It gives you a pretty stripped down rendering. I guess that's okay. It's by default, it looks like that. It's plain HTML, which means you can search it with your file system tools if you're just keeping archives like this and your Facebook one and your Reddit one together on the hard drive. On the downside, it does not give you one file per tweet. It has 1 month archives, which sort of makes sense. But it's not what I think the best possible form is. I'm not a lawyer, but there is no Twitter JavaScript there, so I think you could probably just put that up on a website and be okay legally speaking. On the plus side, though, it gives you Markdown, so you can do a little more to it if you want. Oh, and I forgot to mention, yeah, it does transform user IDs into usernames and real names, which is helpful, but it does not automatically solve that half conversation problem. So we have it, we've transformed it a little bit into a useful form. It's microblogging. What if we just decide to migrate it from those 4 options into a free service? You can't actually do that to Mastodon, at least not directly. There is no bulk import facility allowed. I found one utility that purports to do that, but in reality, the Mastodon project and most of the big server admins are staunchly against that. There's discussion at that issue. And I gotta say, it does make sense for a live service. 20 years of tweets, for instance, you don't want to blast that out as new posts, certainly. Like that's not, you're not writing those things, right? And if you were going to import them into Mastodon as if you had never used Twitter, you would have to backdate them all, which you can do by directly inserting them into the database, but no other person's server is going to let you do that. And it wouldn't really be kind to your followers to do that. And if you went ahead and imported them historically, would they see it? Quick aside, there is an import feature in the Mastodon settings, but that is just for user accounts from that you want to follow. Okay, alternatively, you could run your own server. You could do the manual database inserts. The thing is, there is a lot of overhead to running a Mastodon server. It takes your time, and from what I've heard, it is pretty resource intensive. And you have to have server admin skills. Like, I care about the user experience in theory, so you shouldn't have to be a Unix server admin to have freedom, right? Now, like some of that overhead in managing the Mastodon instance could just be code that could be cleaned up, like maybe architectural refactoring will make it easier to work with. But some of that complexity is inherent to it being a Mastodon server because it has to do all the federation, the server-to-server stuff. It has to do the activity pub. And we don't actually need to do that to put our old Twitter history up. Going back to the archive converter, the archive parser from before, I will say I think the most interesting option is to repurpose it and to host the tweets on your own site. They used to call that posse, post on your own site, syndicate elsewhere. People still do that. If you follow Cory Doctorow, he does this in high volume fashion. So yeah, why not put tweets online on your own machine, on your own domain? Yeah, it's kind of not posse though. It's stuff that you already published somewhere else and you're just pulling it in. So I thought about what the opposite of a posse was, and I landed on fugitive, but I have not yet figured out what it stands for. Anyway, yeah, like the Mastodon case, this is static stuff. You're not going to be adding another Twitter post from 2012, right? So yeah, that's pretty autonomous. We can just put the post on our own site. I did this just by converting the markdown files that came out of the parser. And the goal here was really to focus on that remapping. So like the URLs of the old tweets are there. If someone favorited it or liked it or cited it in a paper or something and the original link dies, you can at least, if you have this like clear remapping, you can compute what the new location would be. And it's deterministic that way. So this is what I think the end step of that would look like. This is what I believe is the better alternative to deletionism. You announce, look, I am archiving all these things on my own domain. You pin that or you put that in your profile, and then you go about your day. Yeah, it's going to be huge. If you try to open that URL, it doesn't work because I haven't actually deployed this, and I'll explain why. Let's look at the actual contents of the parsed markdown. Like I said, it's a month at a time. What we want to do is grab the original URLs there and grab that slug at the end of it, use that. Probably want to grab the date and time, and then turn that into your static site generator stuff. And yeah, it's static content, static site generator. Just a bit of Python. Well, the title field is tricky. I couldn't figure out what to do with that, so I started with just the date. And then, yeah, the slug is what's going to end up at the end of the URL. I also sort of tracked whether it was a reply or a retweet. But yeah, it's a few lines of Python to do that. Does anybody spot a problem with it? I'll give you a couple seconds to think. Then we'll find out. Okay, we'll come back. Okay. The results of doing this, passable. Obviously, from a graphic design standpoint, impeccable. I've played around with a minimal theme, trying to build it up in the right direction. Although, note that even though I'm splitting it up into individual tweet articles in Pelican language, you can still use a standard plugin to recreate the monthly archive pages or just the paginated everything index pages in addition to individual URLs. It does include images, although the screenshot doesn't include any. So why haven't I rolled that out? For one thing, it is thousands of files. That it builds up slowly, but it is a lot. And also, I do occasionally, like in this year, I've only tweeted a few things. It was at an event, which I was on the team for, and incrementally adding to it, I haven't figured out how to do that yet. For one thing, smoothing out the repagination is important. You might have to drop that. I might have to go only with individual tweets and the monthly archive, because thousands of tweets, you add a new one, repaginate all 1,000 of those. There are some technical bits that need some polish too. I keep finding things I need to change or add to it. Like I didn't grab the hashtags and turn those into Pelican tags. Again, I use Pelican because I've used Pelican before, and the Markdown format of Pelican is what I used because it was Markdown output to begin with. It was properly escaped for that. I should make it look more like the tweet pages so it's not confusing to people, which means putting the profile image and making it look like an older version of Twitter in a little bit. And then the titles are not useful. I'm not sure what the title should be, maybe the original URL, and it just needs to, the theme needs to make it look nicer. But let's talk about that problem with the ellipse. Initially, you can see it, well, it's not on this, but you're correct, it is there. The ellipse cuts off the tweet because it's a retweet, and the root of this problem is that that is how it looks in the archive that you got from the Twitter data export service. So it's not a complete sentence. It doesn't really solve the conversation threading problem, and it is worse than that. But thinking about it, those are someone else's words, right? This is not my content. If they posted a photo, do I have the right to republish that on my own site? Maybe not. Ironically, in this case, because I might have actually written that Texas Unexpressed tweet because I'm on the team, but in general, you don't own the stuff that is the other half of the conversation. So you don't get it in your archive, so it's less useful. But I think that might be how it has to be. That's the social networkness of it, right? Is it's not all done in isolation. Still, I think it's a better approach, right? Your content stays on the internet, the URL mapping means it's still findable, whatever the company does. But yeah, there's limits to that. Thousands of files, you can't single-handedly solve the conversation threading problem and the replies and the permissions of other people. But that's just the tweets. What about the other stuff? I would say likes and bookmarks. That should be easy. So I pivoted into trying to do something with that next, and that didn't work so well, mainly because the Twitter archive only gives you internal IDs for those. And the parser, even though it generated lists of usernames and user accounts based on IDs, it hits an API rate limit when you try to do the likes. And I think that's because it's someone else's, it's not your account. So there's a different limit set by Twitter for that. So it can't automatically turn all of those likes in your archive into bookmarks that you can use. So instead, I worked with some other likes and bookmarks that I exported. There's a lot of them. A lot of the things that are the content that we have saved in a social network or favorited or starred or followed or watched or subscribed is a URI or URL of some kind. And what would you in theory do with those? It's not really a clear case for just importing it into your Firefox bookmarks. Editing bookmarks in Firefox is tricky. As the collection grows, it becomes virtually impossible to do. So I thought, well, I'll put them all together. I'll tag which service they came from, and I'll use a separate bookmark manager. That becomes tricky too because you get a different format for everything. So some of them CSV, I think Reddit is CSV files. XBL, bookmark extension language, no one has used that since 2005. OPML, something called the Netscape bookmark HTML format, which is what your Firefox bookmarks become, which is different than the account backup that you do, which is JSON. And then you don't get metadata in a lot of cases. You don't get the title of the thread. Again, that's the API use case. And the last thing to mention there is bookmark managers rarely optimize for that. They're usually designed for adding new things. I tested several of these. Zotero was mainly for other things. I just already used it for research purposes. I think out of the ones that I tried, I liked Buku the best, LinkedIn probably second. I did it with Reddit and GitHub and Mastodon, I think. That's what Buku looks like, its web interface. It also has a terminal mode, which is probably why I liked it. to a font guy terminal mode is great because it's just all fonts, right? That's Flask SQL Alchemy, I'm pretty sure. Buku does the best at like the conversion between those formats. It doesn't do everything, but some of them, like LinkedIn, only imports the Netscape bookmark HTML, which is sort of HTML without layout, and it's weird. I think LinkedIn looks nicer. It's also multi-user, which Buku is not. So you could have accounts and authentication. Buku's server module, you have to, proxy it up if you want to access it from elsewhere. So I don't know if I declare victory on links or not. I need to spend more time on that. Quickly looking at the other two pieces here from the Twitter case, though, in theory, the follows and followers are people, so you could import those into your contact manager. Obviously, that varies depending on the service. But yeah, most of those data exports have minimal information in them, so you have to manually figure out who to map all those account names to, which can be non-trivial. Private messages, there's not really a unified format to do that. I was tempted to try and also convert those into something that not much could take care of, and found to my amusement that MailDir does not want to be used. Like the documentation says, do not do this if you ask what the format is. So, it's probably still something that is possible to work with, but not an obvious solution. It needs to stay private, so okay. Conclusion times, and wrap up the key points, I think. First of all, the services don't do a great job of giving the user export stuff. As I mentioned, Flask applications are not designed to work with importing big data sets, and we can only have these piecemeal tools per service for migrating and repurposing. One definitely needs a change. I don't think that the HTML indexes you get from Twitter and Google Takeout were made out of deep-seated altruism. I think they probably do that just to have fewer support requests, so Flask can at least hit that point, right? Number two, it's going to depend on the application. I think it's a clear win for users if you do more with your map data. Three is the really sticky one here. Apart from some coincidences, the data from two unrelated services is not going to be the same, so there's not a universal translator on the horizon. So what do we do? Can we make it more palatable? Well, I think it starts with doing it. I would encourage you to do this. If you've downloaded your Twitter archive, convert it, repurpose it, post it yourself, and then blog about it. Tag me if you want to write it up. I don't know if my proposed hashtags are going to work or not, but organically they'll take off probably. Then yeah, of course, all of these are small piecemeal tools that could use some contributions. That also applies to the data utilities and the regular free software apps importing data sets. Number three, there probably needs to be some centralized information. Is this Debian's problem to solve? Not specifically. It's also not collinear with FreedomBox, even though I've mentioned that a few times. But people in the project care, so I want to hear ideas on this. That includes me. I will release the Pelican theme when I think I've got it settled down in the little converter script. I kind of started an awesome list, but I'm not satisfied with that. Apparently there's rules to how those are supposed to work, and I didn't know that till Friday, and I think I prefer something else. Like the awesome lists you see on GitHub are just lists, and I think you need a little more context and information for those things for it to really be what I would want to use. And the last thing is, don't take this as the final word. Get an export and do something I have not discussed with it. That's the end. I'm ending, as I always do, with the font credits. I think we might have time for questions. If not, I'm happy to answer them for the rest of the day. Thanks.
I'm wondering how much of the lack of this is that people who are serious about not using the big tech stuff just never started using the big tech stuff and hence don't have anything that needs to be exported. Like me. But I also tend to not go around trying to promote the idea of not using big tech stuff, because my personal alternative is often and just do without, and I don't consider that a persuasive pitch, so I don't bother.
Yeah, that's true. I'm sort of, I guess I'm trying to talk within the context of the stuff people say to people who do use the big services. And you know, in a way, that's sort of how recruiting people into free software causes goes. They might not have used it before, and they don't need the same sales pitch as other people. But yeah, definitely true. Not everyone uses Twitter. Not everyone did last year or whenever it was fun. So, yeah. All right, time for lunch, right?